Shalom. We are here again with a message from the wisdom of Torah. We are studying the portion of Shoftim, which is in the book of Deuteronomy, Dvarim, from the end of chapter 16, from verse 18 of chapter 16, all the way until the end of chapter 21, or to the middle of chapter 21, to verse 9 of chapter 21. From Perek Tetzayin, Pasuk Yud Chet, all the way till Perek Kaf Aleph Pasuk Tet. This week's portion deals with leadership. Shoftim, judges, shotrim, which in our language today we would call policemen, but it's more like officers, people who are in charge of implying the decisions of the law. We are talking about the Kohanim and the Leviim, the priests and the Levites. We are talking about the king. In verses in chapter 18, we're talking about the prophets. So we have various different leadership. As I said, the Shoftim, the Shotrim, the Kohanim, the Leviim, the king, Melech, and the Navi. And the Torah begins from the beginning of the portion. Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol shorecha. There is a command to appoint these judges, to establish a jury system in every one of your cities. B'chol sharecha. V'shaftu et ha'am mishpat tzedek. And they are to judge the people righteously. They are to judge the people fair judgments. Lo tateh mishpat, lo takir panim, lo tikach shochad. Any kind of discrimination is illegal, of course, for a judge. No bribery. Tzedek tirdof, we say, justice, more justice. Chase justice. You should pursue justice. These are quite obvious commands for a judge. He has to judge with righteousness. He has to be a fair judge. He has to be careful not to get into any discrimination. Later on, in chapter 17, in verse 2, we are already going into the various different cases which the judges deal with. Whether it's somebody who's caught dealing with idol worshipping, or it's in verse 8 of chapter 17, in any kind of matter of judgment, ki palei mimcha davar la mishpat, ben dam ledam, ben din ledin, whether it's questions of blood, whether it's questions of judgment, whether it's questions of plague marks, or any kind of questions that there is a dilemma. And of course, the establishment of the different various ways of running the jury system. Witnesses, according to the law, Pia Torah, etc., etc. But among these laws that deal with the establishment of the judgment, of the jury system, suddenly there are 3 verses that basically have no connection to the question of judgment. I'm talking about chapter 16, verse 21, Perek Tetzayin, Pasuk Kaf Aleph. Lo titalecha ashira kol etz, etzel mizbach Adonai Elohecha asher ta'aselach. You are not to plant an ashira. An ashira is a tree which is used for idol worshipping in various different houses of idols. Lo takim lecha matzeva. You're not allowed to set up any monument. Something that asher sanei Adonai Elohecha, God totally dislikes monuments that are representing places of worship. In the worship of God, there's an altar, a mizbeach, which is put together with several stones, and not a matzeva, which is a one-stone monument. And the 3rd verse, do not slaughter, lo tizbach l'Adonai Elohecha shor vaseh, asher yeh bo mum kol davar ra. You're not allowed to bring any offering that has a blemish or any bad thing, any mum, anything bad in it. So these 3 commands, the illegalness of bringing an Asherah, planting an Asherah, the illegalness of building, of establishing a matzeva, a monument, and the fact that it's forbidden to bring any animal as an offering if it has any kind of blemish, it's not complete. What is the connection of these three verses to the entire dealing with leadership, with judgment? The other point that I wanted to point out is that when we're talking about judges, suddenly in the middle, in chapter 17 and verse 9, it mentions not only the judge, Uvata el ha-kohanim ha-leviyim ve'el ha-shofet. You are to come. It's talking about a case where the local court couldn't get to a decision. Ve'kamta ve'alita. It says, and you get up and you raise and you go up and you ascend to the place el ha-makom asher yivchar Adonai Elohecha bo. You go up and you ascend to the place which God has chosen, and you come and meet with the Kohanim, the Leviim, and the Shofet, the priests, the Levites, and the judge. And the question is, what are the Levites and the priests doing here? If it's a question of judgment, we want to go to the judge. The aspect of judgment in the Torah, as described in this week's portion of Torah, has a very important message. Though there are many commands to the judge, and there are many levels of judge. There's the local judge, and there's the Supreme Court, which sits in the place chosen by God, as it mentions. And then upon there's the king, who is above all of them. But in a parallel level, there is an establishment of the Kohanim and the Leviim, the priests and the Levites. What is their job? If we look at the end of our portion of the Torah, and we once again meet the Kohen and the Shofet, and there we see that each one has a different function, has a different mission, we may be able to understand the difference between them and the need of both. In chapter 20, the Torah begins a series of lessons dealing with preparation for war. And chapter 20 begins as follows. Ki tetzei milchama al oivecha. When you're about to go out to war against your enemy. V'ra'ita sus v'rechev, and you see the other nation has many, many horses and is very strong and has a strong army. V'haya. Kekorvachem el hamilchama. And it shall be, when you're about to go out to the war, when you're getting near the battle, V'nigash hakohen v'diber el ha'am. The Kohen, a priest, will talk to the people. Later on, in chapter 5, V'dibru hashotrim el ha'am. Those law officers, those police, those representatives of the judges will also talk to the people. But there's a difference between what these will say and what these will say. The Kohen is coming with an ideal speech. Ve'amar alehem, and the Kohen says to the people, Shema Yisrael, listen Israel, Atem krivim hayom lamilchama. You are going out to war. You are going out to the battle. Al yirach levavchem, al tireu, al tachbezu. Don't be terrified. Don't be fearful. Don't do anything out of haste. For the Lord your God, He is going with you. Ki Adonai Elohechem holech imachem. Lehilachem lachem. Im oivechem lo shia etchem. Your God will be there to save you. So the priest who is guiding the people before they're going out, he's telling them the ideal. Don't forget. Don't forget the guide, the goal. Don't forget the reason that you're going out for war. Not because you like war, but because you are fighting the war of God. You are going to protect God's name in the world. You're going to capture the land God has sent you. And therefore, don't be fearful. Don't be afraid of anything. Don't be terrified. Don't be hasty. You are going, and He is actually dealing with the motivation of the people. On the other hand, comes the Shotrim. And the Shotrim get up and say something else totally. And they're actually, it seems that they're contradicting. They're telling the people to go back home. If anybody has built a house and he's not finished the building, or it's not established and not moved into the house, go back home. If anybody has planted a vineyard, a field of fruits, of grapes, go back home. If anybody is engaged to a woman and he has not married her, go back home. If anybody is fearful, go back home. And the policemen, or the shotrim, who are actually implying the decisions of the Shoftim, they're not here to deal with ideologies. They are here to deal in the practical world. In the practical world, there are those who are fearful. There are those who their mind is not totally in the war. There are those whose mind are on their new wife they've just engaged with. There are those who are ready to go back to their house they haven't moved into. These people won't be able to concentrate on the war. The Kohanim are there to give us the ideology. The Kohanim are there to teach the Torah. The Kohanim are there to give us the word of God. The Shoftim and the Shotrim are to translate that word into a practical life. We mentioned before that one of the important chapters, one of the important topics dealt with in this portion is the establishment of a king. We're talking about the leadership which stands in the place chosen by God. The king is referred to a person chosen by God. Melech asher yivchar Adonai Elohecha bo. And he has to write the word of God. And he has to carry the Torah on his arm all the time. And also, he says he is to study with the Kohanim and the Leviim. V'katav lo et mishneh sefer HaTorah hazeh. I'm reading in chapter 17, in verse 18. Ala Sefer, he writes the Torah, milifnei HaKohanim HaLeviim. And he is to study the ideology. He is to remember that he is here representing the leadership of God. So if I am to summarize this week's portion, leadership has a hierarchy, is built in a structure of hierarchy, which on top is God, the king, and the Kohanim, and the judges and the Kohanim, but they all have to remember the source of their authority is the fact that they are living according to the word of God. Therefore, when the Torah begins in this week's parsha, in this week's portion, dealing with the different laws of the judges, they deliberately add three verses, reminding us that worshiping or the establishment of a jury system is just like the worshiping of God on the altar, just like the worshiping of God, and it has to be totally complete. Just like no animal can have a single blemish, can be any kind of mum, so too your justice has to be totally and comprehensive. And in all of this is part of the worship of God. Because the source of the authority of all the leadership, whether it's the king or the Kohen, whether it's the judge or the prophet, the source, the authority of all of them is going in God's way. And God's way is tzedek, is righteousness. And God's way is from the ideology of the Torah taught by the Kohanim, the priests, and the Levites. Let us hope that we will all be able to establish our lifestyle and our daily life according to the ideology taught to us by the word of the Torah, by the word of God, also the word brought in our portion. Shabbat Shalom.